Clara Bennett was 23 and completely homeless. 3 weeks after sleeping her last night in the back seat of her aging sedan, she stood inside a quiet probate office in Pike County, Kentucky, holding the only unexpected thing that had happened in years. A lawyer she had never met informed her that a distant great-uncle named Elias Bennett had left her a small 19th-century smokehouse behind the ruins of an abandoned family farm. There was no farmhouse worth saving, no bank account, and no farmland included. Only the old smokehouse. Stranger still, the attorney quietly added that someone had continued maintaining the building every season, even after Elias died, though nobody would say who. Clara almost refused the inheritance. A forgotten smokehouse sounded less useful than the car she had already lost to repossession. Then she remembered she no longer had anywhere to return before nightfall. She accepted the worn brass key, folded the deed into her backpack, and slipped her small hand-carved maple bird into her coat pocket. The smooth little carving had followed her through foster homes, rented rooms, and shelters since childhood, the last object she had never been able to explain. By late afternoon, she drove a borrowed pickup along a narrow gravel road that disappeared between weathered tobacco fields and bare oak ridges dressed in late October colors. The farmhouse appeared first, collapsed inward beneath decades of neglect. Behind it stood the smokehouse, built of thick limestone blocks darkened by generations of hickory smoke. It should have looked abandoned. Instead, the stone steps had been swept clean. Fresh boot prints crossed the damp leaves toward the heavy wooden door. Clara tightened her grip around the maple bird before choosing to climb the steps anyway. As she reached for the iron latch, a warm lantern began glowing softly behind the smoke-stained window, though she had seen no one enter the building. Clara kept one hand on the cold iron latch while the lantern glowed steadily through the smoke-darkened window. She waited for footsteps that never came. After another long breath, she eased the heavy door open and found only quiet. The warm light came from an old kerosene lantern resting on a broad oak curing table. Its glass chimney had been cleaned recently, and the flame burned with the steady confidence of someone who knew exactly how to tend it. She did not call out. Instead, she crossed the room slowly, noticing the swept limestone floor, neatly stacked split hickory beside the wall, and a cast iron kettle polished brighter than everything around it. Nothing looked abandoned. Everything looked cared for. She reached into her coat pocket and wrapped her fingers around the small carved maple bird before lifting the lantern. The familiar curve beneath her thumb brought back the scent of furniture wax and cedar from a foster home she had lived in when she was 8. An elderly foster father had spent quiet evenings repairing broken chairs instead of buying new ones. He had never spoken very much, but he had taught her that old wood usually failed where people stopped paying attention. He had shown her how to follow a crack with her fingertips, how to listen before forcing a stubborn hinge, and how patience often repaired what strength only damaged. The memory faded as quickly as it had arrived, leaving Clara standing once again inside the smokehouse with the lantern in her hand. She found herself examining the building exactly as he had taught her years before. The roof timbers were still true. The limestone walls remained plumb. Moisture had been kept away from the lower courses. Whoever maintained the smokehouse understood old buildings remarkably well. Near the back wall, she noticed a narrow strip of lighter stone running from floor to shoulder height, as though part of the masonry had once been opened and carefully rebuilt. She dismissed it as an ordinary repair, assuming frost damage had forced someone to replace a few blocks decades earlier. Instead of investigating further, she chose the practical task first. She checked every window latch, swept away fresh leaves that had blown beneath the doorway, and carefully trimmed the lantern wick before setting it back on the table. The familiar rhythm steadied her breathing. She could not explain why, but for the first time in years she was protecting a place instead of preparing to leave it. Then, from somewhere beyond the smokehouse wall, came the soft scrape of a wooden cane across the stone steps, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone stopping just outside the door without knocking. The scrape of the wooden cane stopped just beyond the threshold. Clara set the lantern down without rushing to the door. When she opened it, an elderly man stood on the swept stone path with a canvas feed sack resting against one leg. He wore a faded brown chore coat, clean work boots, and the patient expression of someone who had been arriving at the same place for many years. "You must be Clara Bennett," he said quietly. "Name's Walter Griggs." He did not step inside until she nodded. Instead, he lifted the sack just enough for her to see apples, smoked salt, lamp oil, and a loaf of fresh bread. I bring supplies every Thursday. Been doing it for longer than I can remember. Clara frowned. For an empty building? Walter's eyes lingered on the smokehouse door before returning to hers. It wasn't empty to the man who asked me. He offered no further explanation. Instead, he handed her a folded envelope bearing the seal of the Bennett family attorney. Inside was a certified copy of the probate order confirming that every structure remaining on the old property, including the smokehouse and its contents, now belonged solely to Clara. Attached to it was a brief handwritten note from Elias Bennett. The handwriting was careful but uneven. It read only, "Trust this place before you trust your memories." Clara read the sentence twice. It sounded less like advice than a warning whose meaning had been worn smooth by time. Walter watched her fold the paper back into its envelope. "Folks around here will tell you the smokehouse keeps secrets," he said. "Do not spend your energy chasing stories before you understand the building itself." She almost smiled. That sounded like ordinary country superstition. Yet something in the way he emphasized the last words made them feel larger than ghost stories. Perhaps he meant hidden rooms. Perhaps he meant family history. She could not tell. Walter pointed toward the collapsed farmhouse. "Storm dropped another section of roof last winter. Stay clear of it. The smokehouse is the only safe structure left." That warning carried only one meaning, or so she believed. Before leaving, he reached into his coat pocket and produced an old iron ring holding 3 weathered keys. 2 were badly rusted. The third was newer brass. "These fit the outer gate, the side storage shed, and the well house," he said. "Elias wanted everything left exactly as it was until you arrived." Clara accepted the heavy ring, but instinctively kept her carved maple bird wrapped in her other hand. The little carving reminded her that she had survived unfamiliar places before. She did not have to understand every answer on the first day. She only had to choose whether to walk away again or stay long enough to earn one. Money in her checking account would barely cover another week of groceries. The pickup she had borrowed had to be returned the following afternoon. Every practical reason suggested driving back to town, finding temporary work, and listing the property for sale before winter settled into the hills. Instead, she made a slower decision. She asked Walter where she could buy roofing tar, replacement hinges, and chimney mortar. The old man gave a small approving nod without commenting on her choice. After he disappeared down the gravel lane, Clara crossed the yard toward the leaning storage shed. The brass key opened the warped door with surprising ease. Inside hung hand tools arranged with careful precision, as though their owner expected to use them again tomorrow. She selected a broad push broom, a claw hammer, and a leather tool apron that still fit across her shoulders. When she stepped back into the fading afternoon light and looked toward the smokehouse, the lantern was already burning again behind the window, although she was certain she had extinguished it before walking outside. Clara stood in the middle of the smokehouse until the silence became familiar enough to hear smaller sounds. The limestone walls held the day's warmth longer than she expected, while the thick oak beams above her carried the faint, sweet scent of hickory that had seeped into the wood over generations. Whatever this building had once produced, it had also preserved. She slipped the leather tool apron over her coat, picked up the broad push broom from the storage shed, and began with the simplest task she understood. Before she could trust the place, she needed to know how it was holding together. She worked from the ceiling downward, tapping each exposed beam with the wooden handle. Most answered with the dense, reassuring sound of solid timber. One crossbeam near the rear corner answered differently, producing a slightly hollow note that lingered longer than the others. She frowned but assumed old smoke had dried the wood unevenly. It was worth remembering, nothing more. Next she examined the stone floor. Years of use had worn shallow paths between the curing table and the doorway, exactly where she expected countless footsteps to have fallen. Yet another pattern refused to fit. A narrow strip of limestone along the eastern wall showed almost nowhere at all, although it lay directly beside the most convenient walking route. Someone had deliberately avoided stepping there for decades, or something beneath it discouraged them from doing so. She marked the location quietly in her memory instead of prying at it. Practical problems came first. The chimney had to draft properly before freezing weather arrived. She climbed a short ladder beside the hearth opening, using the same slow, deliberate movements the old foster father had once taught her whenever she inspected aging wood. Loose mortar crumbled beneath her fingertips, but the flue itself remained remarkably clear. Looking upward, she noticed fresh soot resting on top of older blackened layers instead of beneath them. Someone had burned a small fire here not many weeks earlier. The smokehouse had not merely been preserved. It had still been used. That discovery unsettled her more than comforted her. Walter had spoken as though the building belonged to memory, yet the chimney suggested ordinary life continuing almost to the present day. She climbed down carefully and reached into her pocket for the little carved maple bird before brushing dust from her hands. The smooth carving steadied her thoughts as reliably as it always had. Whenever another foster placement ended, she had rubbed the bird's worn wings while deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. This time the ritual led her towards staying rather than leaving. She fetched fresh water from the well house, scrubbed the curing table, cleaned soot from the lantern chimney, and gathered loose shingles that had blown against the foundation. The work transformed the building almost immediately. By late afternoon, the smokehouse no longer looked abandoned. It looked occupied. That realization carried unexpected weight. Without quite admitting it, Clara found herself watching the doorway whenever the wind stirred, unwilling to let the place appear neglected again. As evening settled over the hills, she stepped outside to stack split hickory beneath the overhang before dew could reach it. While moving the final armload, she noticed another inconsistency. Every piece of firewood had been cut to nearly identical length using a modern chainsaw, but the chopping block beside the wall still held fresh marks from a broad-hand axe. 2 different methods, 2 different habits, perhaps 2 different people. She carried the thought inside and secured the heavy door for the night. The iron latch dropped firmly into place. She tested it twice before turning back toward the lantern. Only then did she realize someone had quietly placed a steaming enamel mug beside it. The tea was still warm. No door had opened. No footsteps had crossed the stone floor. And the thin layer of ash she had carefully swept from the threshold remained perfectly undisturbed. Clara slept lightly, waking twice before dawn to listen for footsteps that never came. When morning light filtered through the small, smoke-darkened windows, the enamel mug still rested beside the lantern. The tea had gone cold, but its faint scent of dried mint lingered in the room. She carried the mug outside, expecting to find tracks in the damp earth. Instead, the swept stone path remained almost untouched except for Walter Griggs's deep cane mark from the previous afternoon. Whoever had entered the smokehouse had either known another way inside or had somehow left without disturbing the ground she herself had carefully studied. Rather than chasing impossible explanations, Clara chose the only answer that fit her nature. She would understand the building before trying to understand the mystery. She spent the morning replacing loose hinges on the storage shed, sorting rusted hardware from usable pieces, and sealing small gaps around the smokehouse door before colder nights arrived. She worked slowly because every board seemed worth preserving now. The building no longer felt like inherited property. It felt like something entrusted to her care. Shortly after noon, Walter returned with a coil of hemp rope and a small bucket of lime mortar. He paused quietly when he noticed the repaired hinges and freshly stacked firewood. "Looks like Elias judged right," he said. Clara glanced up from smoothing mortar into a weathered joint. "About what?" Walter smiled without answering directly. About who would stay long enough to notice the little things. It was the first compliment anyone had offered her in months, and it landed more heavily than she expected. Before leaving, Walter handed her a slim ledger wrapped in brown paper. "Found this in my pantry. Elias asked me years ago to give it to the right person after she started caring for the place instead of simply owning it." The ledger contained no dramatic revelations. It recorded ordinary purchases: lamp oil, chimney brushes, roofing nails, flour, salt, apple seedlings. Yet every entry ended with the same initials written in careful pencil. MB. Clara opened her coat pocket and absent-mindedly rubbed the smooth wing of the carved maple bird. On its underside, barely visible beneath years of wear, she noticed the same initials carved into the wood for the first time in her life. She had always assumed they belonged to the craftsman who shaped it. Now the tiny letters became something else entirely. Not a maker's mark, but a connection. The ledger answered one question by proving the bird belonged to this place. It immediately opened another. If MB had carved the bird decades ago, how had it found its way into the hands of a frightened 6-year-old girl, living hundreds of miles away? As evening settled across the Kentucky hills, Clara carried both the ledger and the little maple bird back inside the smokehouse. She laid them side by side beneath the lantern's warm glow. For the first time, the mystery no longer pointed only toward the old building. It pointed unmistakably toward the person who had spent years waiting for her to arrive. Clara left the ledger open beside the lantern long after darkness settled over the smokehouse. Every purchase listed under the initials MB reflected ordinary care rather than mystery. Lamp oil, lime mortar, cedar pegs, chimney brushes, flour. Yet every line pointed toward the same quiet truth. Someone had expected this building to remain alive, not abandoned. The next morning she returned to the eastern wall, where she had first noticed the unusually unworn strip of limestone. The ledger offered no map, but one entry caught her attention: replacement floor braces beneath curing platform. Elias had never written about repairing the chimney or roof with such precision. Why record work beneath a platform unless it mattered? She knelt beside the old oak curing platform and examined its construction with the patience she had learned years before. Most of the floorboards were fastened with square-cut nails forged long before modern hardware became common. For boards near the eastern edge, however, were secured with carefully blackened slotted screws instead. They had been deliberately aged to disappear. She smiled despite herself. Whoever installed them had wanted the platform to remain serviceable rather than permanently sealed. Using an ordinary screwdriver from the storage shed, Clara loosened each screw without forcing the wood. The boards lifted cleanly. Beneath them lay a narrow timber-lined compartment no deeper than 18 inches. There was no chest of coins and no dramatic treasure. Instead, she found a carefully ordered collection protected inside waxed canvas. A bundle of property surveys. Several family photographs wrapped in oilcloth. Maintenance journals spanning decades. A courthouse receipt bearing the Bennett name. 3 envelopes tied with faded cotton tape. A second ledger written in another hand. Everything had been arranged as though someone expected another person to inspect it methodically instead of discovering it by accident. Clara lifted the photographs first. The oldest showed the smokehouse standing beside the farmhouse when both buildings were new. Another pictured Elias as a young man beside an older woman whose face carried the same calm eyes Clara saw in her own reflection. On the back, someone had written only first names and dates. None explained why she belonged here. Then she untied the smallest bundle. Inside rested a child's carved maple bird almost identical to the one she had carried since she was 6 years old. She slowly placed her own beside it on the oak platform. The grain matched. The carving marks matched. Even the tiny initials MB beneath each wing had been cut by the same careful hand. They had never been copies. They had always been a pair. And for the first time in her life, Clara understood that the little bird in her pocket had not wandered into her childhood by chance. Someone had separated the two long before she was old enough to remember why. Clara remained kneeling beside the opened compartment long after the morning light had shifted across the limestone floor. The 2 carved maple birds rested side by side on the old oak curing platform, identical except for the softer edges worn into the one she had carried since childhood. She resisted the urge to open every envelope at once. Whoever had arranged this collection had done so with remarkable care, and the order itself felt like part of the story. She spread the journals, photographs, surveys, and receipts across the freshly cleaned table exactly as they had been stored, then placed the paired birds between them, allowing the familiar carving to anchor her thoughts instead of her fears. The first step was the maintenance journal written in Elias Bennett's steady hand. Unlike the household ledger Walter had delivered, this notebook described work completed inside the smokehouse over nearly 20 years. Every repaired hinge, replaced roof shingle, chimney cleaning, lime wash, and floor inspection carried a date. Several entries referred to preserving access beneath the curing platform, without ever explaining why. Clara compared those dates with the courthouse receipt she had already found. The repairs always followed periods when taxes had been paid late or ownership paperwork had been renewed. At first, she believed Elias had simply protected valuable documents from moisture. Yet another detail refused to fit. Every maintenance entry ended with the same sentence written almost like a ritual. Keep everything ready. She had assumed those words meant ready for another season. Now they seemed intended for another person. The journal answered why the building had survived. It opened a deeper question. Ready for whom? Her second step began with the property surveys folded inside wax canvas. She carefully aligned each survey according to the years printed by the county surveyor. Boundaries changed only slightly across decades, but one feature never disappeared. The smokehouse alone was marked with unusually precise measurements, while the farmhouse received only general notation after a certain year. Someone had continued documenting a building everyone else considered secondary. Tucked between two surveys, she discovered an invoice from a regional lumber mill listing replacement oak floor planks cut to custom dimensions. The dimensions matched the removable boards she had lifted the previous day. Suddenly, the slotted screws she had mistaken for clever concealment became something different. They had not been installed merely to hide the compartment. They had been installed so the compartment could be opened repeatedly without damaging the original floor. Protection had mattered more than secrecy. The discovery answered one puzzle while creating another. If the compartment was intended for regular access, who besides Elias had known how to open it? Clara reached unconsciously for her maple bird and held it beside the second carving. Under the lantern light, she noticed tiny knife marks inside each carved wing that formed matching halves of a simple mountain outline. Separately, they appeared decorative. Together, they completed a single landscape. She did not speak the realization aloud. Instead, she turned to the photographs. Several showed family gatherings beside the smokehouse over many autumns. Faces aged gradually across the collection. Children became adults. Trees grew taller. One older woman appeared repeatedly, wearing the same wool shawl. On the reverse of one photograph, the names had been written in faded pencil. Martha Bennett stood beside a young Elias. The initials beneath both carved birds suddenly carried a name instead of an abstraction. Martha Bennett. Yet the picture answered only part of the mystery. There was no child resembling Clara anywhere in the photographs. If Martha had carved the birds, why had one reached Clara decades later? That question remained untouched. Shortly before noon, Walter returned carrying fresh buttermilk and a sack of cornmeal. Clara invited him inside for the first time. He removed his hat before stepping across the threshold, a gesture so practiced it felt older than either of them. She showed him the photographs, but not the hidden compartment. Walter studied Martha's picture for a long moment before smiling quietly. She believed every child deserved something made by hand, he said. She carved birds through most winters after the tobacco came in. Clara asked whether Martha had carved many identical pairs. Walter shook his head. Not identical. She always said pairs belonged together. He remembered watching her hand one small carving to Elias many years earlier, but he never learned where the second bird had gone. He assumed it had been given away. He also remembered Elias insisting that the smokehouse floor never be replaced with concrete, even when neighbors encouraged the cheaper repair. Walter had laughed at the stubbornness back then. Looking around the room now, he wondered whether Elias had been protecting something far more ordinary than money and far more important than old wood. After Walter left, Clara returned to the journals with renewed patience. She compared dates from the maintenance notebook against entries in the household ledger. The deliveries of lamp oil always increased during October. Chimney brushes appeared every second autumn. Fresh flour arrived each Thursday. Through late fall, none of those purchases fit an abandoned property. She remembered the warm tea waiting beside the lantern. She remembered the polished kettle, the swept path, the fresh soot inside the chimney, and the perfectly stacked firewood cut by two different methods. One by one, those details abandoned their original meanings. The lantern had not been mysterious decoration. Someone expected evening visitors. The weekly deliveries had not supported an empty building. They had sustained a routine. Even Walter's warning changed shape inside her mind. When he said to understand the building before chasing stories, perhaps he had meant that the building itself had been carrying out a promise all along. Yet one final document unsettled every conclusion she had reached. Folded inside the second ledger was a certified county guardianship inquiry dated 6 months after Clara entered foster care. Elias Bennett's signature appeared clearly at the bottom, requesting permission to locate and assume responsibility for his great-niece. Across the final page, however, another official stamp declared the request withdrawn before review. Clara stared at the date, then at the signature again. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Elias. But the withdrawal notation had been filed 3 days after records showed he had already been hospitalized 2 counties away following the accident that left him unable to travel. Someone had withdrawn the petition in his name after he could no longer have appeared in person. Clara left the guardianship inquiry open beside the lantern until the morning sun reached the edge of the curing table. She read the dates again before allowing herself to believe what they suggested. Elias Bennett's signature requesting custody looked steady, patient, and unmistakably genuine. The county withdrawal stamp looked equally authentic. Yet the two could not comfortably exist together. Walter had told her years earlier that Elias never recovered his strength after the farming accident that sent him to a rehabilitation hospital nearly 80 miles away. The maintenance journal placed him there during the same week the petition had supposedly been withdrawn in person. Clara folded the document carefully instead of reaching for conclusions. She had learned enough already to distrust the first explanation that seemed complete. She began by comparing every date she possessed. The maintenance journal, the household ledger Walter had delivered, the courthouse receipt, the property surveys, and the guardianship papers formed a quiet line across the table. She copied the dates into a small notebook of her own, arranging them in chronological order. The pattern became clearer only after she stopped reading each document separately. Whenever Elias disappeared from the maintenance record because of illness or hospitalization, someone else continued purchasing lamp oil, chimney brushes, flour, and firewood. The initials MB never disappeared. The building had never been left unattended. She next compared the handwriting beneath the family photographs with the labels inside the second ledger. The names matched perfectly. Martha Bennett had written both. Elias had written the maintenance journal. The county clerk had completed the official receipts. 3 independent hands, all telling overlapping pieces of the same history. None proved fraud by themselves. Together, they eliminated another possibility Clara had quietly feared. The journals had not been invented later to comfort her. They had accumulated naturally over decades. She picked up the paired maple birds and placed them beside the oldest photograph showing Martha and Elias standing outside the smokehouse. Their carved wings completed the little mountain outline once again. For the first time, she noticed that the ridgeline matched the silhouette visible through the eastern window. The birds had never represented abstract decoration. They represented home. Walter returned that afternoon carrying fresh apples and another can of lamp oil. Instead of asking broad questions, Clara showed him only the guardianship inquiry. He studied the dates with narrowed eyes before removing his glasses and cleaning them slowly on his handkerchief. "I remember the accident," he said. "I drove Elias to Lexington myself. He could barely sit upright. There is no chance he walked." Into the county office 3 days later. His answer settled one uncertainty while leaving another untouched. Walter had witnessed Elias leaving for treatment. He had never witnessed anyone withdrawing the petition. Clara asked whether Elias had ever spoken about abandoning the search for her. Walter looked genuinely surprised. "Never." He rested one weathered hand on the curing table. He said waiting was different from giving up. Folks confuse those two things. The sentence lingered after Walter left because it quietly reshaped dozens of smaller memories. The weekly deliveries, the polished lantern, the repaired hinges, the carefully removable floorboards. Even the warm tea waiting beside the lantern no longer looked like habits performed for a deserted property. They looked like the ordinary work of keeping a promise alive. Clara turned back to the second ledger, reading every page instead of searching only for dramatic entries. Near the final section, she found lists of supplies distributed to neighboring families during difficult harvest seasons. Flour, salt, smoked meat, lamp oil. Beside each delivery appeared a short note reminding the recipient to repay only if able. Elias had never operated the smokehouse as a business after the farm declined. He had quietly kept it functioning as a place where people could receive help without public embarrassment. Suddenly, Walter's Thursday deliveries made sense. They were not mysterious rituals. They continued an old pattern of care that the community understood without discussing openly. The smokehouse had survived because its purpose had survived. Clara walked slowly around the room, seeing familiar details with altered eyes. The swept path was not prepared for a ghost. It welcomed visitors. The polished kettle was not evidence of secret occupation. It expected hospitality. Even the two methods of cutting firewood reflected different generations sharing the same responsibility instead of competing explanations. One older pair of hands had favored the broad axe. Another later caretaker used a chainsaw but stacked every log according to the original pattern. Separate lives had protected the same promise. She carried the paired maple birds to the eastern window and rested them together on the sill. Neither bird looked complete alone anymore. Without speaking, she stopped returning her own carving to the deep corner of her coat pocket where she had hidden it since childhood. She left both birds visible beneath the afternoon light. The movement felt small, yet it changed something inside her. She no longer handled the carving as proof of abandonment. She handled it as evidence that someone had expected a reunion long before she understood its meaning. One question still resisted every document spread across the table. If Elias had truly petitioned to bring her home, who had withdrawn the request in his name, and why? The answer mattered because it separated misunderstanding from betrayal. If the withdrawal had been deliberate, someone had redirected the course of her childhood. If it had been administrative error, years of silence had grown from ordinary failure instead of cruelty. Clara closed the final ledger and looked across the smokehouse she now understood better than ever before. She possessed legal ownership. She possessed the journals, the surveys, the photographs, and the paired carvings. She possessed enough evidence to restore the Bennett family's forgotten history and perhaps invite the County Historical Society to preserve it. She also possessed the quiet option of leaving everything exactly where Elias and Martha had protected it, allowing the smokehouse to remain only a private inheritance. Standing between the lantern and the eastern window, with the paired maple birds resting together for the first time in decades, Clara realized that neither choice concerned property alone. It would decide whether the promise that had waited so patiently for her would end with her or continue beyond her. Clara left the smokehouse just after sunrise carrying only the paired maple birds, the maintenance journal, the household ledger, the property surveys, and the guardianship inquiry. She locked the hidden compartment again with the same careful attention Elias had shown decades earlier. Nothing inside needed to be hidden from the world forever. It simply deserved to be protected until the truth could be carried honestly. Her first stop was Walter's farmhouse. Together they spread the journals across his kitchen table one final time. Neither of them searched for another dramatic answer. They no longer needed one. The dates, the repairs, the repeated purchases, the paired carvings, and the unfinished guardianship request all pointed toward the same quiet conclusion. Elias had not abandoned Clara. He had prepared a place for her until circumstances beyond his control prevented him from bringing her home himself. Walter looked through the window toward the distant ridge before speaking. He always believed waiting was something a person could choose. Clara nodded. This time she understood. Waiting had never meant standing still. It had meant tending the lantern, repairing the hinges, paying the taxes, stacking the firewood, preserving the floor, and leaving every door ready for the day someone finally arrived. Later that afternoon, Clara contacted the County Historical Society, not to surrender the smokehouse, but to begin documenting its history with the original records remaining under her care. The building would stay exactly where it belonged. Its story would simply no longer disappear quietly. The modest historical designation that followed months later helped preserve the structure and ease the cost of maintaining it. But Clara accepted that support only because it allowed the promise carried by the smokehouse to continue rather than end. Before dusk, she returned alone to the old limestone building. She placed one maple bird back inside the shallow compartment beneath the curing platform exactly where Martha and Elias had intended it to rest. The second she no longer hid inside her pocket. Instead, she set it openly on the lantern shelf beside the family journals, where every visitor could see it without needing an explanation. Then she lit the lantern herself. The warm light settled gently across the oak beams, the worn limestone floor, and the smoke-darkened walls that had waited so patiently through the passing years. Outside, evening gathered quietly over the Kentucky hills. Inside, nothing felt abandoned anymore. Weeks earlier, Clara had climbed those same stone steps believing the forgotten smokehouse might become one more temporary shelter before she moved on again. This time she closed the heavy wooden door behind her, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had finally come home to the place that had never stopped waiting for her.